Hey class, this is lecture 30. We're going to look at the cost of capital for several other companies, and then we'll try to figure out what's going on in each instance. So the first company we're going to look at is Tata Motors. Tata Motors, as you recall, is the Indian car company. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing we did for Disney. We're first going to plot the debt ratio of 0, 10, up through 90%. For each corresponding debt ratio, we're going to estimate the levered beta. Right? So this is the unlevered beta because the debt is 0, and then we're slowly going to lever up based on the levered beta ratio. Next, we're going to estimate the cost of equity. Cost of equity is going to be a function of the beta, the equity risk premium, and the risk-free rate. Now, only the beta is changing here. The equity risk premium and the risk-free rate are staying constant through each of these calculations. We're then going to estimate the bond rating. We're going to estimate this bond rating based on the synthetic rating, which is based on looking at interest expense over EBIT. Based on the bond rating, we'll actually be able to estimate the interest rate on debt. Multiply by 1 minus the tax rate, and that gives us the cost of debt after tax. As you recall, when you get very high amounts of the debt ratio, what's going to happen is we're actually losing our tax benefits. Because what's going on in this instance is we're actually kind of maxing out how much tax benefits we get from debt. And so we see a 32.45% tax rate up until 50%. After that, the marginal tax rate, the marginal tax benefit, actually decreases. We estimate the after-tax cost of debt, and finally, by weighting the after-tax cost of debt and the cost of equity, we're able to estimate the weighted average cost of capital. Now, based on our calculations, we see that the weighted average cost of capital is lowest right here at 20% debt. And when it's lowest, we should find the highest enterprise value, and that's exactly what we see. Now, it shouldn't be that surprising that this happens here. The reason that I'm not that surprised is if we look at our numbers, we see kind of a large jump on the interest rate on debt up from 20 to 30, right? So the after-tax cost of debt moves from under 7% to over 10%. It's not surprising we're actually right below that big jump. Now, the actual Tata Motors debt ratio is 29%. So it seems slightly higher than what we estimate. Although, again, we're not actually estimating each number individually, right? We're not estimating 21, 22, 23, 24. So it's unlikely that we're getting 20 exactly correct. It's actually somewhere, close to 20. I do think it's actually closer to 20 than 30, simply because there's a big jump in the weighted average cost of capital from 20 to 30, but there's not that much of a jump from 10 to 20. Next, looking at Vale. We're doing the same thing with Vale, estimating for each potential debt ratio, the cost of equity based on the beta, and the cost of debt based on our synthetic ratings. Now, again, we kind of expect, right, a weighted average cost of capital somewhere in the middle, and that's what we find. A weighted average cost of capital is 30%. This gives us the lowest weighted average cost of capital, although 40% seems very, very similar. So it's probably right somewhere between these two. And that gives us essentially the same enterprise value. Now, again, I'm not that surprised that the weighted average cost of capital is something around here because there's a big jump up in the interest rate between 40% and 50%, right? We see a 10% jump. And that results in about a jump up in the after-tax cost of debt from under 4% to nearly 7%. So I'm not surprised this is where we find the optimal cost of capital. Now, the one thing about Vale is it's actually a mine, right? It's a Brazilian mine. And so you might think that they actually have pretty wide variation in EBIT. If that's the case, we actually might not want to use EBIT from the last year. We want to use over an average over several years. Because the problem is that if there's a really good year, let's say, right, where prices are really high for iron ore or for one of the minerals they produce, they're going to have a very high EBIT. On a very low year, right, and when prices are low, they'll have a very negative, right, or at least, small EBIT. And so there's a real concern that when we estimate this, we're estimating in a high year or low year, and that's going to affect our synthetic rating estimation. And that's actually what seems to happen, is that when we look at the last 12 months, our EBIT is about 15,000. When we look over the last few years, the average is actually much closer to over 20,000. Right? So we actually are estimating a lower EBIT than over the last few years. If we instead plug in this higher EBIT of 20,000, right, taking the average, then we actually find that the optimal capital structure is actually pushed up to 50%. So it is the case that getting this EBIT correct for this kind of high volatility company, right, is necessary in order to get their optimal capital ratio right for both good times and bad times. Now, Baidu is kind of the Chinese Google, right? We're looking at a kind of a young growth tech firm. And young tech growth firms generally are going to actually have very little debt. When we actually look at their optimal debt ratio, what we find is that the weighted average cost of capital is smallest between 0 and 10%, right? So it's, you know, a little bit higher at 0, a little bit lower at 10, but it seems to be somewhere between these two because these numbers aren't very far off. Now that seems very little debt, right? Why would that be the case? Well, the issue is that these are firms that don't have a whole lot of operating income. And if you don't have much operating income, then you really can't cover your interest expenses very well. So even small increases in the amount of debt means that you have a big drop off in your bond rating. And we see that, right? The bond rating already drops between 0 and 10. But after moving from 10 to 20, you suddenly get a huge change in the bond rating from an A- to a double C. And what that means is that the interest rate on debt moves from 5.6 to 13.8. It becomes very expensive for these companies to take on debt because they just don't have enough money to cover the debt payments. So when we look at these types of companies, we generally find that they actually have usually very low debt. In actuality, Baidu has a debt ratio of 5.23, which actually seems to be pretty reasonable based on our estimations. It's also a significantly lower debt rate than the other companies. And finally, Bookscape. Bookscape is the private company that we've looked at. So we actually need to deal a little bit with estimating their debt ratio. So we actually did kind of a simple calculation. This is not something you need to know, but in order for us to move on, we actually need to estimate the debt ratio of 27.8. Based on this information, we're then going to estimate what is, again, the average cost of capital for each different number. And what we'll see is the average cost of capital seems to be smallest, right around 30%. Given that their existing debt ratio is 27.81, that actually seems very reasonable. Again, because the actual number is probably somewhere between 20 and 30 because these numbers are actually not much different, right? So this actually seems like this company, based on our calculations, again, it actually has a pretty reasonable debt ratio. And again, I could have essentially guessed this just by looking at these numbers because the bond rating jumps from 30 to 40%, right? We see a jump from an A3 to a triple C bond rating. And that means the interest rate on debt is going to jump from 4 to 11.5. When this kind of thing happens, right, we can kind of guess that we're going to take a debt ratio optimally right before we have that big jump. All right, so here's 3 different questions. And this is more kind of just an overview of how you would think about estimating optimal debt ratios, right, for different types of companies. So the first, you're assessing the optimal debt ratio for an oil company using the cost of capital approach. A key driver of this optimal debt ratio is the operating income that you attribute to this firm. In coming up with an optimal, which of the following measures of operating income will yield the best estimate of optimal debt ratio? So we have a couple different options. We can use operating income over the most recent fiscal year or over the more recent 12 months, or we can do something over the oil price cycle. Now the concern is that if we have a very volatile company, right, that's really dependent on oil, then we want to make sure we kind of take into account both booms and busts in the oil cycle. So we don't want A or B, we want C, D, or E. Next, when we think about this, we actually want to come up with what is their average, right? So in general, what's going to be the best debt ratio for them, assuming they're not changing their debt ratio year to year, which is actually a little bit tough for companies to do. And so what we're going to say then is that the average operating income over oil price cycle is actually their best bet. You want to make sure you don't have too much debt in good or bad years, or too little debt in good or bad years, right? So you want to make sure that you essentially have the average operating income. Second, young growth companies generally do not borrow much money. Does it follow they're also likely to be underlevered? We saw this with Baidu, right? Baidu only had 5% debt ratio if you look at their actual numbers. If you look at the optimal though, the number seems to be somewhere between 0 and 10%. So it actually seems to be the case that they're not underlevered. The reason for this, like we said before, is that operating income for kind of young growth companies is often very small. And if it's that case, it's actually pretty tough for them to get debt at a very low interest rate, right? Because it's tough for them to cover their interest payments. So the answer is actually no here. They usually can't afford to borrow much money, so their debt ratios tend to be low. Third, the equity risk premium is the price for risk in the equity market, while default spreads are price for risk in the bond market. Holding all else constant, under which of the following scenarios would you expect companies to use the most debt relative to equity? If we think through this, we should figure out, right, that if we are looking at companies that have a lot of debt, that would be because debt is relatively cheap for them, at least relative to equity. So the equity risk premium is in the CAPM calculation, right? So a high equity risk premium results in a high cost of equity. The default spread is in the cost of debt calculation, right? So when default spreads are high, that drives up the cost of debt. So if that's the case, right, we should find out companies using a lot of debt when the equity risk premium is high, so the cost equity is high, and the default spread is low, so the cost of debt is low. So like I just answered each question, the first answer is E. We're going to use the average operating income over in an oil price cycle. Question for two, the answer to two is no. Right? Young growth companies can't borrow much because they actually can't afford to based on income. Answer to three is C. We are going to find a lot of companies using debt when the price of debt is low and the price of equity is high. This concludes lecture 30.